Well, thanks so much to everybody for coming. It's a bit crowded and wasn't expecting so many people. There are no giveaways or anything. Just not sure if people thought there was going to be drinks. So as Amanda mentioned, so I work for GV, which is formerly known as Google Ventures. So it's Google's venture capital team. And what that means is that Google puts a bunch of money into the fund, and we invest in a big variety of different pretty exciting kinds of startups, things like Uber and Slack and Medium and Flatiron Health and Foundation Medicine. It's a huge range across a lot of domains, everything from robotics to AI to cybersecurity, agriculture, all over the place. So it's a pretty unique spot for me as a researcher, because I think that I'm the only researcher actually that works at a VC fund anywhere. So we started a design team in 2009, and since then other funds have hired designers, but nobody else has hired a researcher. I'll let you interpret what that means for me or not. What I've had to do in that role is figure out kind of how do I have big impact, how do I jump in very quickly into new domains that I don't know, ramp up really fast, and deliver for companies where when it's a startup, things are very high stakes usually, because whatever the thing is that they're working on, maybe it's like it's their product, that's all there is, right? It's different from when I was working at Google. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how I got there and kind of some of the techniques and things that I've used and found to be effective there. So going back to 2006, when I first joined Google, I started originally as a researcher on Gmail. And when I showed up, there's this cool thing I didn't know. So I opened the browser and like, they made a doodle just for me. Like, how cool is that? I didn't know they did that for everybody. And I was excited to discover that Google, one of their founding principles, the number one at the top of their list, is focus on the user and all else will follow. So as a researcher, that was really, music to my ears, right? Because what else do I like to do than focus on customers, figure out, well, what do they need? What are they struggling with? How can I help them, right? What would be better for them? How could I, help them do their work and their lives? And then bring that back to teams to build those things and figure out how to make better products. But it doesn't really work great when you do it that way, right? Spend a lot of time maybe trying to convince people to listen to you or trying to convince people to implement some of the ideas and things you have. It doesn't really work great. So focusing on the team works a lot better, right? So if I can dive in, kind of be the anthropologist on the product team that I'm working with to understand much more about, obvious things like what's their schedule, what's their roadmap, what are those nagging arguments that come up meeting after meeting? It's like, gee, maybe if you had some data, you could resolve this. Some of the other kinds of issues that come up for a big team. But there's actually one person on the team that's found is even more important to focus on. And that's what we call the decider. And that's the person who really the buck stops with her, right? So there's most teams that I've worked on, it's not really consensus, not really a democracy. There's somebody who, in the end, is responsible for the business decisions, the product decisions, and it's kind of making those calls, and is juggling a lot of other constraints and pressures. So as much as I can figure out what does that person need, then I can be as useful as possible. And the results that I'm going to deliver are going to be relevant and aligned with what that person needs. So, and when I say figure out what they need, it's not like I send an email and I'm starting with a new founder, like, hey, how can I help you? It's kind of more like turning my research skills, my research focus on that person. So it can be like, think of it like doing an interview or series of interviews where I'm trying to understand not just the explicit things that somebody might tell you, but what's the other stuff that they might not be so good at articulating that they need that's going to help them drive the product, drive the business forward? So these are some of the main things that I dive into is kind of priorities, risks, assumptions, questions, and deadlines. Priorities is kind of an easy one, right? They're juggling a ton of different projects, a lot of different things in different stages. So trying to figure out, well, which of those is really most pressing? And sometimes that's schedule, but sometimes it's not, right? Maybe there's something that's just more important because there's a press event coming up or there's a board of directors meeting or something. But that's a pretty straightforward, kind of what's on your roadmap, what's your schedule. Risks and assumptions is trying to get a little bit deeper to help prioritize and understand what's going on. So when you're building a product, invariably we work with a lot of founders and a lot of companies. There's some things in there that they're like, well, what's the biggest risk? Like, well, if this didn't work or this assumption doesn't prove to be true, like the whole business or the product is built around some assumption about which customers to target or how they do their work or how technology is going to solve it. So what can we do to de-risk? That's a lot of what we spend our time doing, is reducing risk from the process so that they'll be able to move forward. So one way to help prioritize also becomes, well, what are the things that we won't be able to fix later? So if something's a high risk and it seems like a big deal, but actually we'll be able to iterate and address that later on, that's not as big a deal. Something that's earlier on, you're like, oh crap, if we don't get this right, we're gonna be dead in the water. Either because there's major brand implications, or it's gonna be exposed to a lot of people or something like that, where it's gonna be hard to retract it or go back on it. And figuring out what those underlying assumptions are to the whole product become very important, because sometimes that's an example of those implicit things that a founder and team might not talk about, but you can kind of dig in and be like, wow, so what would need to be true for this to be successful? And I want to get into their heads to understand what are the big questions that they have that I need to go answer. What's kind of keeping her up at night? What are the things that she wishes she knew? If she had a magic wand, boy, I wish I knew this about my customers or this about my competitors. And knowing which phase in just kind of the general development process helps me get kind of in the ballpark at least. So I can start and think about, well, roughly the kind of research that I'm gonna need to provide to sort of answer those questions, right? Early on, it's just kind of some discovery. As you're building some things, you're evaluating and figuring out if it's working and then measuring after it's done. And the questions that the decider is gonna be asking are based on those different phases. So early on, like, right, what should we build? What are customers doing? What do they need? What are competitors doing? As you're starting to generate some designs and prototypes and build this thing out, like, well, does it work, right? There's some just basic usability kinds of things. They understand it, can they do it? Do they want it? Is it valuable at all? And then later on, after you've launched something or exposed it to more people, well, does it do what we thought it was gonna do, right? So you're measuring things like conversion and engagement or satisfaction, these kinds of things later on. And then I also need to figure out the timing. So often, right, you ask a decider, when does this need to be done, right? It's like, now, yesterday, why aren't you already done? Which is a great answer in one way, because it indicates to me, like, oh, this is an important thing to you. Like, you wish you had the answer to that now, so maybe that's useful. But it's not helpful to me when I'm trying to plan something, right? Like, oh, okay, well, I obviously didn't do it yet. So what I do is I ask this a little bit differently. What's the latest date that this will still be useful to you? Which there's something about the phrasing of that makes people, partly maybe because it's confusingly phrased, but it makes them stop and think a little bit. And so then they have to kind of back up a little, take a step back a little bit, and just think about, like, okay, well, what does my schedule look like, and kind of what are those other things that are coming up, the other decision points that we have? Maybe, again, it's a board meeting, or I have some big review coming up, or I have a meeting with press, or something's coming up. And they have to kind of think back on what those are. And then when I have all that information, that's how I design my research plan, is based on that. So it's not the other way where I have some like idealized version of my research, like, oh, this is gonna be the awesome way to do this, I'm gonna answer all these questions, and then try to figure out how to get it done, or tell them I can't get it done in time. What they need is how I adapt everything to fit that. And sometimes that means that there can be a very narrow window when I can have a big effect, right? There's something big coming up, they need to figure something out. For me to be able to have some effect, I need to do it pretty fast, sneak it in there. So a lot of the work that I do is adapted to be very quick as a result of that. This last question is kind of a test for the decider. So I could go do all this work, but then what's going to happen? Are you prepared to make changes? Like, what kinds of changes are kind of in scope that we could even handle at this stage? Are they open to the feedback? Are they just going to say, like, well, it would be really interesting to know that? When somebody tells me that, that's usually a sign, like, I'm going to go work on another project, if it's just kind of interesting to you. And I want to know, like, are they staffed and ready to act on this? So then the next step for me, I have all that information of kind of what they need. So now I have to figure out, like, well, what's the thing that I'm going to make? Like, I'm going to go off and do work, but I'm going to have to create something that I'm going to bring back that's going to be the magical answer to their questions. And what's the form that that's going to take? And what I mean by that is there's kind of these different deliverables, and by different phase of a project. And each of these are not methods, right? So I think of this as a deliverable. It's a form factor. It's something that I'm going to create that I'm going to bring back to them. And you can imagine that a lot of these, they're very good at asking specific questions, and I could use a variety of methods to inform any of these, right? It might be some kind of survey tool, it might be interviews, it might be anything else, moderated, unmoderated. But I want to start by trying to figure out, like, what is that going to look like? What is that I need to build? And once I have that, I can kind of shift my focus from the decider back over to the customers, and then go ahead and plan a study that'll be appropriate and do all the things that I know that I now know that decider wants all those things, right? So whatever I'm going to deliver is going to meet that need. So it'll be a useful thing. I'm not going to have to convince anybody to do anything, right? They're waiting for those answers. So when I plan backwards. So for me, I found this is a really efficient way to figure out what do I actually have to do, right? Because I've started out and I said, okay, well, I know what I need to make, what I'm going to bring back to you. And so then I can think through, like, well, what data am I going to need to be able to create that thing, right? If it's a customer satisfaction information, like, what am I going to have to gather to do that? Or how am I going to gather that data? And then who are the people I'm going to need to include and interview or sample or not, right? Who am I including or excluding? And so when I work this way backwards, so I kind of start at the end and work forwards, for me it's this much more efficient way to make sure that when I'm done, I'm going to have what I wanted and what the decider wanted, even more importantly. So in 2010, I joined GV. And so I had been doing things this way at Google, and GV is a little different, right? So I had to figure out, like, oh, what's going to work and what's not going to work, and how do I adapt to this? Because all of a sudden now I'm working with a lot of startup companies instead of working on Gmail and big product teams at a big company. And startups move a lot faster. I'm in a lot of domains that I don't know. You know, you dive in a week and you're like, okay, now I'm working on oncology. Okay, I don't know anything about oncology. And the stakes are much higher. So how would I need to change what I'm doing? So just to give you a sense, this is just some of the companies. We have 320 companies in the portfolio. So I've done a lot of studies with these companies. I do, give you a sense of pace, I do roughly 35 to 40 research projects a year with companies. So I want to tell you about a couple of those to give you examples of how things have shifted and how I do this work. So Flatiron is one. So Flatiron is a very cool company, big data company, and what they do is they organize the world's oncology data to make it more useful to patients, to researchers, to clinicians. So they have things like a oncology EMR. They have an outcomes database for academics. And one of the big things, and a lot of tools for oncology practices to help them run. One of the big things that they've always wanted to get deeper into is to helping with clinical trials. So as you know, probably, cancer is kind of a big deal. So about 40% of men or women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. But only 4% of those will be enrolled on clinical trials. So for a lot of people, they don't need some novel, cutting-edge treatment. But the problem here is that there are a lot of people who maybe could benefit from that, and they don't get access to it for a host of reasons. It also slows down the pace of completing clinical trials. So you have to think about a clinical trial. The whole idea is you have somebody who's developed a new treatment that we think will help more people and treat more people with cancer. And you want to get that approved and into the market as fast as you can so you can help more people. But you need to test it on a lot of people, right, before you get out. And so until you can gather all those people and get them through the trial, you can't release it and expose it to more people. So for a lot of reasons, to get more treatments, to accelerate the pace of development of these treatments, it's really important to get more people onto these trials. The problem is it's really hard it's like a needle in a haystack to find individuals who are eligible for a specific clinical trial, to kind of match them up, because I don't know if anybody here has seen these things, but these exclusion and inclusion-exclusion criteria for some of these trials are like these giant documents. They're very complicated. It's all these different things, criteria you need to meet. And you need to identify that patient at this very particular time. So you need to flag and identify that patient before the oncologist has met with that patient and already discussed some other treatment or put them on some other treatment. So it turns out, just because of the flow of the practice, it's kind of this narrow little window you have to find that person, get it communicated to the doctor, get them interested and willing to do it, and then talk to the patient. So it turns out to be a big problem. So Flatiron wanted to help solve that. So meet Alex. He's the decider at Flatiron who works on the trials stuff. So I spent a lot of time with Alex trying to understand, like, what do we need to do? So he's at the time is at this very early stage, like, what do we need to build, right? So it's really trying to define and figure out who's this for and how, kind of what are we targeting. The big questions that he has are, how can we accrue more patients faster? That's the high level. So accrue in this, it means how do you find and enroll patients onto a clinical trial? So how do you just get more people on these quicker and faster, more streamlined? So it kind of begs the question, like, well, if you look at practices now, how are they doing this? If you go to community cancer practices or academics, how does this work? And what's the difference? Is there something distinct about the way it happens in community cancer practices versus at academic centers, like if you were to go to at Yale or UW here or something like that, which function very differently? So then the risks here I'm thinking about are, well, will they adopt this? Like how the workflow in a physician's practice, in an oncology practice, it's hard to disturb or perturb that. Things you can imagine, the doctors are moving really fast from place to place, and that everything is set up in a very particular way to streamline that and keep everything, all the trains running. So how will they adopt this even? Like, how do we insert ourselves in a way without messing up the whole system? Will they trust Flatiron to actually do this, to identify patients for them? Because if they don't trust them, they're going to go do the work for themselves anyway. That's not going to work. And who are the right users? So on the one hand, is it community practices or academics or both? Or is it the physicians, or we really need to target the nurses or the clinical research staff or coordinator? Like, exactly who is the right people here? And if we get the wrong people, it's going to be a big problem. And the timing was before a design sprint. So we had planned a design sprint already. They were going to work with us. It was like 3 or 4 weeks after this. So with all that information, so like, okay, now I have this stuff, spent a lot of time, so now I can kind of plan the study and figure out what I'm going to do. So again, I'm going to start at the end, kind of mentally check my menu, like, so what is he going to need to answer those questions? Like, what am I going to have to magically bring back? So if I go through these and I think about the kinds of questions that these are useful for, to me, it's pretty clear, like, what I'm going to need is some kind of workflow, right? The fundamental starting point is to understand, how are they doing this now? Because without that detail, it's hard to make any changes, right? Or to see where are the friction points, or what's working well, what's not working so well so far. So again, then I plan backwards. So I know that's what I'm going to have to come back with, but how do I get that? So I know I have a workflow. So what data will I need to generate that? I'm going to need to understand all the steps, right? Who's doing what? What are the inputs and outputs? What are all the handoffs? Kind of what are these people each responsible for? How are they measured, right? What are their metrics and goals? And so what are the existing tools that they're using? It turns out, right, there are a lot of spreadsheets that they're tracking and keeping track of and sharing around. There are all these calendars that they're using, et cetera. So I have in my head, like, oh, I'm gonna have to get this stuff. So then how am I gonna get that? I'm gonna have to go visit the practices. So you can imagine some other set of data, I'd have to do something very different. But this leads me clearly, like, okay, I'm gonna have to go there. We're gonna have to interview a variety of people who have these different roles and have them kind of walk us through these things, show us the tools they're using, show us how they do this, et cetera. One small detail for me was to think, like, okay, so this is all, it's patient data, so they're very sensitive about that. So I have to be careful to not record much stuff. So I have to figure out ways around that a little bit. So, and then who's the sample? In this case, we had to go to community and academic centers because we needed to have that comparison, so we had to make sure we included those. And these were practices that Flatiron already had some relationships with, which made the recruiting, for me at least, made the recruiting much easier because in this case, they had to handle that. So this is what we did. So we headed out, and this has become kind of a standard practice with Flatiron. We go on these road trips every once in a while. Which are fairly intense. So interviewed a big variety of people, 5 centers in 3 states in 4 days, like planes, trains, and automobiles. And the results of this in terms of impact, I mean, it's driven many, many months of development of a significant piece of their business. So they We've done multiple design sprints, and I've done multiple additional research on these and some other prototypes and things we've come up with. And there are practices that are using this. So they're doing pre-screening for a whole lot of practices to identify patients for them. So this is kind of working, and it's out there, and it's opened up a huge piece of their business and informed a lot of those decisions. And this schedule here, you see in 4 days. So this brings up another point, which is that one of the big changes from going to GV was just the speed at which I had to move. And that was a big adjustment. So I always thought, like, oh, I moved pretty fast at Google. And then I got to GV and started working with a bunch of startups, which I hadn't really done before. And they are moving like crazy fast. And the stakes are high, and they're just, I had to figure out how am I going to do this and still make this useful to them while they're like zooming by. So there are a couple things about being fast. So one is that, like, the faster the turnaround, some of the things I discovered, like the faster that turnaround is, it helps reduce any resistance to doing the research. Because if you ask me, oh, I need this thing, and I'm like, oh, it's going to take me 3 weeks, I can totally have awesome answers back. You're like, oh, whatever, like I have to do something in 2 days, so forget it. If I can get you something back in the time frame that you need, like, you'll probably do it, you'll agree. And if I were to go away for a long time, especially as a startup, things are changing a lot. There's a risk that the priorities might shift kind of while I'm off doing whatever I'm doing. So if there's a big project, I definitely try to break it up into small pieces as much as I can, just be returning good data and value as fast as I can. And keep in mind, at GV, I essentially work for 320 startups. So there's a lot of pressure for me to kind of get in, figure out what's going on, ramp up as fast as I can, and deliver high value to them and kind of move on. So a lot of the things that I've done in my practice is organized for speed. And also, as I'm working with them, I'm usually trying to model how to do this research so that they can do it. So if I were to like go off to my magical little lab and do some things that they don't have access to, that's not actually helpful for me, because I want these companies all to be very successful and to integrate this and practice this themselves. So I'm modeling things that are pretty accessible to them, hopefully, and training and mentoring a lot of people. And so when you think about, like, when is user research useful, right? There's kind of this decision point. We've talked about having all those along the schedule. And the value is really before that, right? Afterwards, it's too late, nobody cares. They're not going to listen to me. Problem with startups, right, is those decision points come very quickly, and there are a lot of them. So I needed to figure out how to, like, squeeze things into this narrow little window and have more impact. And I usually don't have very much notice. So some of these things it's not like I know in 6 weeks I'm going to be working on something. It's just like I'll get a call, and like next week I'm working on something, or sooner. And so when I was at Google, my schedule looked a little bit more like this, right? I would work with the recruiting team, and we would recruit some people to talk to. They'd be kind of spread out maybe over the course of a week. I'd conduct a bunch of interviews, spend time analyzing, and do the report, and deliver that to the team. And everybody would be happy, and hopefully, it takes 3-4 weeks. Now what it looks like is, let's say on a Tuesday, I know I'm going to be doing a study, so I start recruiting, line up some interviews, I do 5 interviews typically on a Friday, and I'm done. And that's it. So there's the reporting, everything happens kind of real time with the team right there, because everybody's participating. There's much less pressure for me to report anything, because they've all seen it, and we've all together debriefed and decided what's next. So one of the benefits of this is to get the team organized to actually watch all of the sessions is much easier this way, because we kind of compress the schedule so they can block out a day and they'll actually come and watch it, even if I'm traveling or whatever we're doing, if we're on the road or at a truck stop or wherever I'm doing the research. Compressing it makes it much easier for people to participate. So I want to tell you about another story of another one, which is Savioke. So this company makes a robot which will deliver things to you at your hotel room. So imagine you're in your hotel and you forgot your toothpaste or whatever, and you dial down to the reception, and somebody would have come and delivered it to you. This robot will show up at your door and give this to you. Super cool. And they had a pilot set up at the Aloft Hotel. This is down in Cupertino in the Bay Area. And they were going to be kicking this off. But there were some big questions. So how should this thing behave? So these are robot experts. So they have this thing, like it will navigate its way through a hotel. Like gets on the elevator, like it's totally amazing. But what will happen when it not runs into people, but when it encounters other people in the elevator, or people encounter it? Like how How should it react? What should it do? What should it do when it shows up at your room? So that was a big question, but this thing is not like personality. It doesn't do that much. I mean, it's amazing what it does, but it comes to your room and it gives you a toothpaste. Like it's not WALL-E, it's not R2-D2. And if you were to design it to look like that, what happens is it sets a lot of expectations for people about how they can interact with it. And they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to provoke more than it could do, right? It sets expectations. People are like, oh, it's not doing anything and now I'm unhappy. So it just doesn't have any personality built into it. So that was kind of the question, like really? So no personality? Like what do we do? So to help figure that out, we did a design sprint. The GV team did a design sprint with them. I'm not going to go into much detail about what a design sprint is like. I'm going to focus on the research side. But it's this 5-day kind of signature way that we work with teams where we very quickly will map out kind of what the ideas are and prioritize them and choose them. And in the course of that time, focus on a piece of a problem and prototype it and test it. And so this all gets done in 5 days. If you have more interest, check out the book or the Sprint book website, if you want more details about that. But the key thing that I want to emphasize here is that on Monday, we schedule the interviews for Friday, right? So again, I'm doing this from the researcher's perspective. Like, oh, it's Monday. I don't know anything about the business yet, right? Like, because yesterday I was working with farmers, or the day before I was working with some other thing. And now I'm doing robots. So we plan this study, and what happens is this really helps the team get a lot done by Friday, because they're kind of in the hot seat. They know this is going to happen. I first discovered this effect when I was working with Jake Knapp, authors of the book, and on our team. We were working at Google on some early stuff that eventually turned into Hangouts and some other real-time communication stuff. And we would be working away and making designs, and the team would be working away, and I would schedule a study. And then the productivity of the team, it was like amazing how much got done in like those couple days before a study. They would just crank out stuff and figure everything out and get it all ready because they had that deadline, which is kind of this like fuse for the team. And we've incorporated that idea into the design sprints that we do, and it's huge for helping everybody kind of get going and very focused, as you can imagine, on what you need to get done with that deadline. But it also puts me in the hot seat, because I don't know that much yet about the company's business, what their goals are, right? All these things we talked about to understand their questions. I need to figure that out very, very quickly. So let's review. So at the end of the day on Monday, so the team is sprinting and kind of hashing through all the issues and trying to figure out what they want to do. At the end of the day, so I know, okay, I have a remote control robot, and we have this mapped out. So they've mapped out the whole kind of journey, imagine, of the life of the robot, all the different interactions from reception to the room. And they've decided, okay, we're going to focus on that delivery moment. We're going to try to figure out what happens when this robot shows up at somebody's door in the hotel. Okay, so now I have to very quickly again, so I'm working with the team and trying to understand, like, what are you guys doing? What do I need to do? So their key questions are kind of, right, this important piece I need to understand for them so I can deliver what they need. What do people think, like, without a robot, just with humans coming to your door and delivering stuff, like, how do people feel about that? What are their experiences with that? What's good or bad about that? And what's going to happen when people unexpectedly come across a robot? Because one of the questions was, like, how much context or explanation do people need? Like, they're probably, if you're just in the elevator, you're not going to have a whole lot of explanation, maybe. So how will they react to seeing that? And how will they react to whatever personality that we create or prototype? Is it enough, too much? There's just some basic usability stuff. Like, can they get the thing out of the robot? Like, there's this lid that pops up. Like, do they understand how to just work it and interact with it? And is there anything more that they want to do with it? There were some ideas or questions about, like, well, people want to, like, take pictures of themselves with it, or do a, like, because it's weird. It's just, some of it is just like, whoa, there's a robot in my room, you know. So there were a lot of questions and like assumptions built into these things about, like, oh, we think this is how it's going to work. So again, then I'm going to plan backwards once I have all this stuff. So in terms of deliverable, if I look back at my mental list, I'm like, okay, well, really, it's kind of this concept evaluation, right? There's this idea of, like, well, imagine a robot comes to your door and delivers things to you. And there's also the concept of a personality. Like, what if it were like this, right? What if it were like that? There's some basic usability kinds of things. Can people interact with it? Can they complete the tasks that we want? And we want to know a little bit more about deliveries and people's attitudes and expectations about deliveries with people versus with robots. Okay, so then, all right, well, so what kind of data am I going to need to make sure I collect? So this kind of basic task completion stuff. I want to see people's reaction. So one of the things that's going to be important is that moment when somebody opens the door and there's a robot there, like I need to see that, right? Because if I don't see that, then it's going to be a bummer, right? That's like a core piece of what we're going to want, is this first initial reaction as well as after. We want stories about other people's, about these people's experiences staying in hotels and getting deliveries, that kind of thing. As I said, capture videos of all this stuff. So how am I going to get that? So observations are going to be really important. I'm going to have to interview people to get some of these stories and things. And I'm going to have to do it in a hotel. So we kind of went around initially. I'm like, well, how would I set this up in a lab or in their office or whatever? And we realized it's going to have to be in the context of a hotel, because otherwise there's just too many weird things about it. And so it just has to be in a hotel and has to be a little bit of a surprise. So I didn't want to warn people. And luckily we had this pilot set up with the Aloft Hotel, so they were used to having this team and this robot kind of cruising around the halls anyway. And so then who do I need to include? What's the group of people I'm going to recruit so I can get the appropriate kind of data? Big believer that you need to recruit fast, but you also want to be very selective and make sure that you have the right people who are giving you the feedback. Otherwise, I don't really trust the feedback very well, especially if I'm doing relatively small. It's 5 people I'm talking to. I need to make sure it's the right 5 people. So the way that I think about this, and I do this kind of with the team, is who do you want to talk to and who do you want to exclude? And what I find often is the who do you want to exclude is a pretty valuable, like who do they want to talk to, they can kind of rattle off. And then to force them to think about like, who do you want me to filter out is a pretty good exercise to get them to think about that a little harder. Because it's that, kind of one way I ask them is like, well, let's imagine somebody walks in and the first few minutes you guys are like, oh no, this person is, like what's the fill in the blank? What's that thing that you're all going to be like, oh, crumb. So in this case, what they're looking for are people who are occasional travelers, so they're not doing it all the time, and they're staying in these kinds of hotels like the Aloft. They're not staying in super fancy hotels, and they're not staying in like Motel 6. So they're used to being able to call down and having like a reception desk and having people make deliveries or having room service, this kind of thing. People who've ordered stuff, people who have smartphones. We're looking for just a little bit of a sense of kind of tech adoption and kind of appetite for that sort of thing. And so we want to exclude people who are professionals in the industry. So if somebody walked in that first 5 minutes and they start interviewing, they're like, oh, you work in a hotel. Like, I totally don't want to talk to you, right? Or you work in a restaurant where you might have deliveries. Like, it's just going to be the wrong person. I don't want people who are very frequent travelers. So the theory there was that people who are doing this a lot have kind of their system, and they're maybe less likely to be forgetting stuff. Like they're somebody who's really like a road warrior is probably not the people we want. And as I said, certain kinds of hotels. So based on that, I create this very careful screener that helps me identify these people, without revealing who I'm looking for, right? I don't say, I'm looking for people who stay at hotels kind of like this and like that, right? Because everybody's like, I would like $100. Yes, I stay at those hotels. So I write a very careful screener. And where else would you post something? If you're trying to convince people, random people you don't know, to come meet you in a hotel room. So this worked very well. And when I post these things, I'm not revealing that I'm from GV. I'm not revealing Savioke. And get a ton of responses. So I actually use Craigslist a lot. The key to doing this is writing a very good, careful screener. So after I've confirmed people, or after people have kind of said, I've selected the group that I want to talk to, send them this confirmation email. And part of what I was trying to do was to, maybe it was more me, but get over this like weirdness of this whole thing. And so I did all these things to try to establish my legitimacy. You can check out my profile online at the gv.com website, and I'll have my badge and my business card. Like I was doing everything I could to make it not seem as weird as it really was. So while I'm doing that, so I'm in the background spending all this time prepping and getting ready for the research. Everybody else in the sprint room all week is working really hard, right? So come some Wednesday, so they're developing a variety of different risky ideas, things they want to try out. So like should this thing have a face, right? We want to create some sort of personality. What kind of face is it? And so they came up with all these different kinds of ideas. And everything from just a very basic, there we go, like a red glowing eye, like from, 2001 Space Odyssey, and this super creepy one. And so again, what you're looking for is this balance of something that seems friendly, but not too friendly. And so they ended up going with this one, which is actually, it's kind of, I think of it as polite, but maybe not super friendly, right? Because again, you want it to seem approachable and pleasant, but not like you're going to hang out or do Wall-E R2-D2 things with it. They came up with some ideas for some different games that it might play, and then a little dance that it would do after it had completed its mission for you. So these are all things that were just like, will these work? We don't know, right? Just have to evaluate them. So then come Thursday, build a prototype. So they already have a robot, so we didn't have to build the robot. But what they're doing is things like the sound effects. So how is it communicating? Can we make it seem friendly-ish? R2-D2-ish kinds of things. This is John and Daniel on the GV design team. So they're designing, so what you can see here, so this is Nexus 7. So that's essentially what the face is. The personality is going to be on this little tablet that's perched on top of the robot. So everything we're designing is going to fit onto that. So it's all the little interactions, the little face, the buttons and things. So that's what they're designing there. And then Tessa is working with the robot, so you can see she's remote control driving it. And she's working on the choreography. It's like, what is this thing going to do when it shows up at the door? Like, how does it behave? So then Thursday night, so I live up here in Kirkland, so we're doing this in Cupertino. So I fly down. This is an actual photo. And go to the Aloft. And so I check into my lovely Aloft room. And the next morning, what we have to do is transform that hotel room into our lab. Right? So I lived as lightly as I could. And so this is us just trying to get everything set up. You can see all kinds of stuff all over the place. And the trick for me, and this was more complicated than I normally would do, but I try to keep my kit as simple as possible. So this is true whether I'm doing something in my own office or I'm traveling or anything. Again, this gets back to my trying to model things in a way that the companies I'm working for can be like, oh, I could do that, right? There's nothing huge or fancy or expensive about this. So just a couple MacBooks, tripod, webcams that I have set up. So I have one facing this way, one facing that way. I've had to kind of block out and think through not just how am I doing the interview, but where are we going to be standing and where am I going to stand so that the cameras can actually capture the person? Not in a weird, like unnatural way, but I've had to think it through. So I have all of this stuff. I have one drop cam. So Adrian is setting up a drop cam this is basically at the doorway. So you imagine somebody opens the door and it's going to capture that when they first see the robot. And one robot. So that's what we've got. So then 9 a.m., first participant shows up, meets me in the lobby, and another real photo. I spent some time in the bar area just chatting with them, partly to build some trust. Again, I feel weird about just taking people up to this hotel room with me. And I haven't told them anything. Right? It's like, we're going to go to the hotel room, and there's all these cameras and some new technology. So I'm trying to just chat with them a little bit. And some of this is just getting a lot of background information about previous experiences, staying at hotels, getting deliveries, room service, these kinds of things. It's actually information that I want, but building some rapport. And what I'm doing is, with my phone, I'm dialed into the Hangout that everything else is going to be connected to, so the team can actually observe all that, even when I'm just wandering around or I'm in the lobby. So then we go up to the elevator, take them into the room, and again, I'm asking all kinds of questions about where do you put your luggage, and how do you unpack or not, and eventually get to kind of well, what do you do about room service, and how do these things work for you? What have you done in the past? And well, what would you do if you forgot your toothbrush? I'm like, well, I'd call downstairs. I'm like, okay, well, why don't you do that? And they're like, okay, and so they call downstairs, and it says they're going to send this thing right up, and we just keep chatting, whatever. So while this whole charade or whatever is going on in the hotel room, at the GV offices in Mountain View, the team is watching all of this. So these different screens, so they're dialed into the Hangout. So each of these is a different view. of me and the rest of the room that's there. This one that's lower down is the drop cam view. So that's kind of, if you imagine the view from the threshold of the door down onto the robot that's waiting outside. Close up of that. So you can sort of see the person's first reactions and hear them and whatever. And open it up. So I'm standing there. So we do this 5 times. 5 participants come through. And again, this is about compressing the interview schedule. That whole team is watching all of it. And while they're watching, we do this kind of real-time analysis. What we're doing is building a matrix. So if you imagine each row is a participant, and then you have like key questions or key assumptions that you're trying to figure out across this matrix. So as each interview is happening, or maybe right after each interview is happening, we're kind of keeping track of like, well, what worked well in green, or what didn't work so well in red, and just things that are like, oh, that was interesting in black. What happens is at the end of the day and through the course of the day, the patterns just become pretty obvious. So one of the other benefits of doing this kind of compressed schedule is that it's much easier to do the analysis. So you've all done it, you've lived through it, and you've seen it, it's all loaded in your brain. The patterns are just really obvious, the big things that you need. Maybe not every single detail, but those don't matter. You just got to go do the big things anyway. So some of the big initial findings from, how do people feel about deliveries now? They're kind of weird, right? There are all these things that make it pretty awkward, actually, it turns out, to have a human come to your bedroom that you don't know and deliver stuff. And they're not sure, like, how do I tip them, or when do I handle that? And people didn't like that. And like, is it safe? I'm like by myself in the room, or do they come into the room? Like, that's even weirder for people. Like, if I can meet you at the threshold and get something, it's fine. But like, people are bringing in food and coming into your bedroom, it's awkward. So there's just all kinds of parts of this that it seemed like maybe we could do better or mitigate a bit. When people saw the actual robot, this is pretty much what happened. They're like, whoa, a robot. There is a robot at my door. So the initial reaction was just super positive. Just consistently, people were like, oh my God, I love this. And I don't have to tip, and I don't have to do all these other things, and it's just there, and I send it away. So like, well, what about these other things, right? We had tried out some of these other ideas about the games and the face and doing the dance. So games, it was nobody needs to like hang out with the robot. They weren't interested in additional quality time with that robot. But the face worked really well. It was like the right balance for things, and that little dance people kind of enjoyed. So what I want to show you is that they've built this thing, right? So it's out there. It's in the Aloft hotels and also in Crown Plaza, some of their hotels. And what I want to show you is a small clip of a video that Savioke has created. It's kind of like on their press page. So this is how they now, it shows you what's actually built into the robot in terms of the impact that we had and how they're marketing and talking about it. So the team, they built it, right? They built it and it's in hotels. So it's super cool. It's pretty close to what we actually had designed together. So that's neat. So this is just kind of a quick summary of some of the lessons, the hacks that I learned from doing this and adapting. And if you want more detail about how I do some of this research, there's I've written a lot of articles on research sprints and a lot of other details. And if you're super interested, you should check out the book also. Thank you very much.